The bright studio lights illuminated the set, casting a warm glow over the polished glass desk where Rebecca Hayes sat, shuffling her cue cards with nervous energy. The air in the studio was electric. Tonight's guest wasn't just another Hollywood actor promoting a movie. No! Tonight's guest was Clint Eastwood, a living legend, a man who had built his career on grit, truth, and unapologetic masculinity. A man who had faced down outlaws, war zones, and even an empty chair at the Republican National Convention with the same steely resolve. And now, he was sitting across from Rebecca, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. Rebecca had prepared for this. She had combed through old interviews, watched clips, and read think pieces labeling Eastwood as outdated and problematic in modern Hollywood. She had her questions ready, sharp, pointed, designed to make him stumble. This was her moment to challenge him, to expose what she saw as outdated thinking in a world that had moved past his brand of rugged individualism. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have prepared for, was that Clint Eastwood wasn't the kind of man who stumbled. The calm before the storm. Backstage, Clint sat in his dressing room, sipping a cup of black coffee. His assistant, a young man in his late 20s named Jake, fidgeted nervously. "Mr. Eastwood, are you sure you don't want to go over the talking points?" Rebecca Hayes is known for being aggressive. Clint set the cup down and gave the young man a wry smile. "Son, I've been doing this since before you were born. I don't need talking points. I just need to be myself." Jake nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "It's just she's going to bring up Dirty Harry, and the chair thing, and probably your political views. Are you ready for that?" Clint chuckled. "Kid, I've been ready for that since the day I stepped in front of a camera. Don't worry about me. Worry about her." Jake hesitated, then pulled out his phone. I don't want this to turn into some viral moment where she twists your words. You know how these things go these days." Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "Listen, Jake, I appreciate you looking out for me, but here's the thing. I've never been one to back down from a fight. And if she wants to make this about politics or agendas, well, she's in for a long night." Jake smiled faintly. "I guess that's why they call you the man with no name, huh?" Clint grinned. "Something like that." The interview begins. The crowd applauded as the cameras rolled, and Rebecca greeted the audience with a polished smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a Hollywood legend with us, a man who has graced our screens for decades. Please welcome Clint Eastwood." The applause grew thunderous as the 94-year-old icon walked onto the stage with a casual confidence, his signature squint and quiet authority filling the room. He took his seat, adjusting his blazer, and gave Rebecca a polite nod. She smiled back, but there was something in her eyes, a gleam of anticipation. "Clint, it's an honor to have you here tonight," she began, crossing her legs and tilting her head. "You've had an incredible career, but times are changing, wouldn't you say?" Clint leaned back slightly, resting an arm on the chair. "Times always change. People stay the same." Rebecca chuckled lightly, as if she had expected that kind of answer. "Well, Hollywood has certainly changed. There's a new generation pushing for more inclusivity, diversity, and social awareness in films. How do you feel about that?" Clint shrugged. "Depends on what you mean by pushing. If you mean telling good stories with good characters, I'm all for it. If you mean replacing storytelling with agendas, well, I've never been much for lectures disguised as entertainment." The room was silent for a moment. Rebecca blinked, then quickly recovered. "So you think Hollywood is lecturing audiences?" Clint gave a slow nod. "You tell me. Are movies today made to entertain, or to make sure everyone checks the right political boxes? Seems to me, the more Hollywood tries to fix things, the less people show up to the theaters. I don't need a studio executive telling me what to think. I sure as hell don't need an actor doing it either. The audience murmured. A few claps sounded from the back of the studio. Rebecca stiffened. This wasn't going how she had planned. The exchange heats up. She switched gears. But don't you think the industry should evolve? I mean, some people feel that certain old Hollywood stars and filmmakers, yourself included, represent a past that we should move beyond. Clint let out a dry chuckle. And who decides that? A few folks on Twitter? Last I checked, the only thing that matters in movies is if people watch them. You can be as politically correct as you want, but if your movie flops, what does it matter? Rebecca's lips tightened. She glanced at her cue cards, as if searching for a way to regain control. But don't you think there's a responsibility for actors and filmmakers to use their platform for change? Clint folded his hands on his lap, his voice steady. My responsibility is to tell good stories, to entertain people, not to preach at them. People pay their hard-earned money to escape reality for a couple of hours, not to be told how to think. That's the difference between me and a lot of folks in this town. I don't assume I'm smarter than the audience. The room was dead silent. Even Rebecca had no quick comeback to that one. The final blow. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, but pressed on. But surely you must acknowledge that some of your films, Dirty Harry, for instance, could be seen as problematic today. Some say they glorify violence, police brutality, even toxic masculinity. Clint's expression didn't change. He simply exhaled, then leaned forward, locking eyes with Rebecca. You know what's funny? He said. The same people who complain about my movies will binge-watch TV shows full of murder, drugs, and criminals. They'll cheer for a villain on screen, then turn around and tell me my movies are the problem. Makes you wonder if they're really offended, or just looking for something to be mad about. A ripple of laughter and applause spread through the crowd. Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it. She had no words. The fight had left her eyes. Clint sat back, shaking his head with a smirk. You know, there was a time when people could just watch a movie and enjoy it. Maybe that's the real problem today. Too many folks looking for a fight instead of a good time. The crowd erupted. Standing ovation. Even the crew members were clapping. Rebecca, seeing no way to salvage the interview, forced a smile. Well, Clint, this has certainly been enlightening. Clint nodded. I do my best. As the credits rolled and the cameras cut, Rebecca exhaled, rubbing her temples. She had expected to control the conversation. Instead, she had been steamrolled. Clint stood up, stretched, and gave her a firm handshake. No hard feelings, he said, his voice cool and composed. She nodded, defeated. None taken. The interview clip went viral within hours. Social media exploded with reactions. Clint Eastwood just schooled that host on live TV. Absolute legend. This is why old school Hollywood will always be better. They didn't bow to nonsense. Watching Rebecca squirm was the best part. Even mainstream news outlets picked it up. Some praised Clint's unapologetic stance, while others called it tone-deaf. But one thing was undeniable. Clint Eastwood had once again proved that he wasn't just a Hollywood legend. He was a force of nature, and he had left the liberal host speechless. As Clint left the studio, a small crowd of fans had gathered outside, holding signs and cheering. He paused for a moment, signing a few autographs and shaking hands. One young man, no older than 20, stepped forward, holding a DVD of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Mr. Eastwood, you're my hero, the young man said, his voice trembling with excitement. I want to make movies like you someday. Clint took the DVD, signed it, and handed it back. Kid, if you want to make movies, just tell the truth. Don't let anyone tell you what to say or how to say it. That's all there is to it. The young man nodded, his eyes wide with admiration. Thank you, sir. I won't forget that. Clint gave him a pat on the shoulder and walked to his car, where Jake was waiting. As they drove off into the night, Jake glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Eastwood, that was incredible. You really shut her down." Clint leaned back, his eyes closing as the city lights passed by. Just another day at the office, kid. Just another day at the office. The next morning, Clint sat on the porch of his ranch in Carmel, California, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over the hills. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the distant chirping of birds. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Another text from Jake. "Mr. Eastwood, the interview has over 10 million views already. You're trending everywhere." Clint chuckled to himself. He hadn't set out to make a statement, but he wasn't surprised that people were talking. He had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. As he sat there, reflecting on the night before, he thought about the young man who had approached him outside the studio. He thought about the stories he had told over the years. Stories of heroes and villains, of right and wrong, of the human condition. And he thought about the state of Hollywood today, where it seemed like everyone was more concerned with being woke than being honest. He took a sip of his coffee and smiled. Maybe, just maybe, his words would inspire someone to tell a story that mattered. And if they did, well, that would be a legacy worth leaving.